moving in both directions. For multinational corporations with deep pockets and specialized legal teams, these barriers are manageable, albeit costly. However, for the backbone of the British economy, the small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, these frictions are often insurmountable. SMEs, which historically relied on the simplicity of the single market to move goods seamlessly, suddenly found themselves facing mountains of paperwork, delays at ports, and the necessity of hiring expensive customs agents or compliance officers. Many SMEs found that the complexity and cost of these new administrative hurdles exceeded the profit margins on their EU exports, leading to a simple, painful decision: stop exporting to the EU. This voluntary withdrawal of thousands of businesses from a crucial export market represents an immediate and permanent drag on national trade volume and economic output. This friction leads directly to logistical paralysis and an unacceptable rise in operational costs. The time taken to move goods across the English Channel has increased due to mandatory checks, causing delays that destabilize just-in-time supply chains. For manufacturers, reliance on rigid supply chains means higher inventory costs and increased vulnerability to shocks, which are then passed on to consumers. The system has become fundamentally inefficient, requiring more human effort, more time, and more capital to achieve the same result as pre-2020 trade. This loss of efficiency is the very definition of a productivity sink, ensuring that the UK's output per hour worked remains structurally below that of its major competitors. The long-term consequence of this irreversible trade friction is a sustained investment drought and a strategic capital relocation. International investors, particularly those looking to establish manufacturing or distribution hubs to serve the European continent, prioritize stability and frictionless access. The UK, post-Brexit, offers neither. The complexity of trading with the EU from the UK, coupled with the political risk of future regulatory divergence, makes it a less attractive gateway to the continent than locating production directly within the EU single market. For example, in the Netherlands, Germany, or Ireland, this strategic redirection of capital away from the UK starves the economy of the essential investment needed for R&D, capacity expansion, and high-value job creation, ensuring that the UK will lag behind in the industries of the future. The decision by major automakers and technology firms to prioritize investments outside the UK is merely the most visible evidence of this profound structural shift. Moreover, the regulatory divergence itself introduces further complexity. To remain competitive globally, the UK must either choose to remain aligned with EU rules, a rule taker, or diverge significantly. Significant divergence, while offering perceived sovereignty, creates two separate regulatory regimes where products must often meet two different sets of standards, multiplying production costs and trade friction. This is the UK's permanent trade trap. It must trade with the EU because of proximity, but it cannot trade efficiently without surrendering sovereignty, and it cannot assert sovereignty without incurring massive economic costs. In summary, the fatal flaw of irreversible trade friction is the foundational wound that guarantees the UK's protracted structural decline. It is an economic brake that applies pressure to every layer of the economy, squeezing SME margins, elevating supply chain costs, driving away foreign investment, and cementing the UK's position as a low-productivity, high-cost trading nation. No amount of fiscal stimulus or monetary tinkering can overcome a structural barrier designed into the very mechanics of international trade. This permanent lack of trade efficiency ensures that the UK is structurally incapable of generating the growth required to offset its mounting demographic and debt liabilities. The structural impediment of irreversible trade friction detailed previously finds its immediate compounding crisis in the logistics and labor paralysis now gripping the United Kingdom. This is the second fatal flaw, transforming the nation's supply chains from efficient, fluid mechanisms into costly, constricted bottlenecks, while simultaneously creating a chronic, self-sustaining inflationary pressure that guarantees the UK's prolonged entrapment in the debilitating state of stagflation. The paralysis is directly traceable to the abrupt and absolute cessation of the free movement of people, a core consequence of the political choice of a hard Brexit. For decades, the UK economy, particularly in its essential service, logistics, agriculture, and healthcare sectors, relied heavily on a steady, flexible, and affordable inflow of labor from the European Union. These workers were not merely marginal contributors, they filled critical, often low-paid, roles that ensured the seamless operation of the physical economy, from seasonal harvesting to HGV, heavy goods vehicle, driving and frontline care provision. The sudden closure of this labor pipeline created an immediate and profound shock to the labor supply. Unlike economic models that transition labor over time, the UK faced an immediate, large-scale void in key sectors. The most visible and economically damaging manifestation was the severe shortage of HGV drivers. This deficit was not just a matter of inconvenience, it represented a direct physical constraint on the capacity of the entire supply chain. Goods could arrive at ports, but the infrastructure required to move them rapidly to warehouses, retail centers, and factories was critically impaired. This logistics paralysis has a cascading financial effect. It increases operational costs, forces companies to maintain larger, more expensive inventories as a hedge against delays, and slows down the velocity of money and goods throughout the economy. The cost of labor in the paralyzed sectors skyrocketed as businesses were forced to offer massive wage premiums to attract scarce domestic talent, an expense that is instantly passed on to the consumer, fueling domestic inflation. The consequence of this labor-driven pressure is the embedding of chronic, localized inflation. This inflation is distinct from the global energy and food price shocks that affected all Western economies. The UK's inflation has a significant sticky domestic component rooted in the tight labor market conditions caused by labor scarcity. In sectors like hospitality and basic services, the structural inability to access cheap, flexible EU labor means that businesses are paying higher real wages for lower average productivity, creating a cost-push inflationary spiral that is immensely difficult for the Bank of England to control without triggering a deep recession. This brings us to the core economic danger: stagflation. The UK is trapped in a situation where high, persistent inflation, fueled by labor and logistics costs, coexists with stagnant or minimal economic growth, fueled by trade friction and a resulting investment drought. The conventional tools of monetary policy are rendered ineffective. Raising interest rates aggressively to combat inflation risks choking off the already weak growth, plunging the economy into a deep, painful recession. Failing to raise rates allows inflation to continue, destroying the purchasing power of the pound sterling and destabilizing financial markets. The UK is facing an intractable policy dilemma, with no easy escape route. Furthermore, the labor paralysis is critically damaging to the UK's largest expenditure areas: healthcare and social care. The National Health Service, NHS, and the social care sector have been profoundly reliant on international recruitment, including from the EU. The sudden reduction in recruitment has exacerbated existing staffing crises, leading to unprecedented waiting lists and a systemic decline in the quality of public services. This decline is not merely a social issue, it has direct economic costs. A less healthy population is a less productive workforce, and the immense fiscal resources required to plug the resulting service gaps further strain the already over-leveraged federal budget. The UK's economic model, which has historically relied on the frictionless movement of goods and people to sustain low prices and high service levels, has been crippled by the deliberate erection of friction. The logistics and labor paralysis acts as a permanent handbrake on the nation's ability to generate the productivity gains necessary to grow out of its massive debt and demographic liabilities. This structural failure guarantees a future defined by diminished economic output, rising costs, and a continuous erosion of the living standards that were once taken for granted. The system is structurally incapable of efficiently delivering goods or services, ensuring that the burden of this paralysis is paid for by every citizen through higher prices and lower quality of life. Beyond the immediate self-inflicted wounds of trade and labor paralysis, the UK economy faces a set of foundational structural vulnerabilities that guarantee its long-term crisis. The relentless ticking of the demographics and debt time bomb. This is the third fatal flaw, a non-negotiable reality that fundamentally compromises the nation's fiscal solvency, ensuring that political promises of a return to prosperity are mathematically impossible without unprecedented and highly destructive levels of taxation or spending cuts. The demographic time bomb is the most insidious and inescapable crisis, acting as a slow-motion, structural wrecking ball. Like many advanced Western economies, the UK has sustained decades of birth rates below the replacement level, the $2.1 children per woman required to maintain a stable population. The consequence is a guaranteed future defined by a severe imbalance in the dependency ratio. This imbalance generates two devastating financial outcomes. First, a shrinking working-age population. As the large cohorts of baby boomers continue to retire, the proportion of the population that is actively working, paying income taxes, and contributing national insurance is shrinking relative to the total population. This constrains the potential for sustainable, long-term GDP growth and places an ever-increasing fiscal burden on a smaller base of younger workers. Even if productivity per worker were to dramatically improve, a phenomenon that is currently hampered by the logistics and investment paralysis discussed earlier, the sheer arithmetic of fewer workers supporting more retirees undermines the entire economic growth forecast. Second, exploding unfunded social liabilities. The shrinking worker-to-retiree ratio directly translates into geometrically increasing costs for two key statutory obligations: state pensions and healthcare. Aging populations require significantly more complex and resource-intensive medical care, driving up the costs of the National Health Service (NHS) to unsustainable levels. Similarly, the obligation to fund the state pension system, often operating on a pay-as-you-go basis, requires diverting ever larger portions of current tax revenue to support retirees. These liabilities are not optional budget items. They are legal entitlements, creating a persistent and growing drain on the exchequer. Expert analysis consistently shows that the unfunded liabilities for pensions and healthcare alone will, within 2 decades, dwarf the current levels of national debt, guaranteeing a future defined by crippling fiscal pressure. This demographic reality renders the UK's massive sovereign debt, now exceeding text 100% dollar of GDP, a far more serious threat than comparable debt levels in nations with younger, growing populations. The UK's high debt burden is no longer a temporary deficit issue, but a fundamental challenge to its long-term solvency, as the future tax revenue required to service and amortize this debt is structurally undermined by demographics. The danger of this sovereign debt is magnified by the specific financial structure of the UK economy, particularly the sensitivity of the housing market tripwire. The UK has a historically unique reliance on variable rate or short-term fixed-rate mortgages. When the Bank of England is forced to raise interest rates to combat the chronic inflation fueled by the logistics and labor paralysis, the pain is immediately and directly transmitted to the household sector. This creates a devastating cycle. Inflation rises due to labor scarcity and trade friction. The Bank of England raises rates to cool inflation. Mortgage payments skyrocket due to the variable rate structure. Household disposable income collapses, leading to a sharp drop in consumer spending. Economic growth stalls, guaranteeing the continuation of stagflation. The housing market, once a source of wealth and stability, becomes the ultimate economic tripwire, linking the UK's inflation crisis directly to its massive text £2 trillion mortgage debt load. This reliance on high household leverage ensures that the government and the central bank are constantly forced to choose between managing inflation and protecting the housing market, leading to policy paralysis and prolonged economic suffering. Finally, the cumulative effect of the demographics and debt bomb is fiscal policy paralysis. The scale of the required fix, a combination of massive tax increases and unprecedented cuts to public services and social spending, is politically toxic and virtually impossible for any democratically elected government to implement. Any serious attempt to balance the books would plunge the economy into a deep, sustained depression, thereby ensuring its failure. This political paralysis guarantees a future of continuous fiscal drift, where debt continues to accumulate, inflation remains structurally elevated, and the structural vulnerabilities are simply left to fester, ensuring the long-term, terminal decline of the UK's economic position. The time bomb is ticking, and the political will to disarm it is non-existent. The terminal structural decay of the UK economy is completed by the convergence of its fourth and fifth fatal flaws: the over-reliance on the perceived, yet increasingly fragile, illusion of financial services dominance, and the debilitating, self-perpetuating underinvestment trap that starves the nation of the capacity needed for future growth. These two factors ensure that the UK lacks both the productive base and the necessary financial resilience to overcome the systemic shocks detailed previously. For decades, the UK, specifically London, justified its economic model by positioning itself as the unparalleled global hub for financial services. The narrative was simple: As manufacturing declined, the city's prowess in banking, insurance, asset management, and complex legal services would generate the massive surplus, high-value jobs, and tax revenue needed to support the rest of the country. This narrative is now a dangerous illusion of dominance. The fragility stems directly from Brexit, which shattered the core mechanism of London's undisputed European supremacy: passporting rights. Passporting allowed UK-based financial firms to seamlessly sell services across the entire European Union with minimal regulatory hurdles. The loss of these rights forced major banking, insurance, and asset management firms to relocate significant assets, personnel, and operational capacity to EU centers like Frankfurt, Paris, and Dublin to maintain market access. This was not a temporary shift. It was a permanent, structural transfer of capital and regulatory control. While London remains a massive financial center, its primary advantage relative to its past is shrinking, and its regulatory future is uncertain. The EU is actively seeking to repatriate critical financial activities, particularly derivatives clearing, from London to the continent, a move that directly threatens hundreds of billions in transaction volume. To counter this, the UK is forced into a high-stakes, risky game of regulatory divergence. It must deregulate and innovate faster than the EU to attract global capital. But this very divergence creates further friction for firms trying to operate across both markets, raising compliance costs and fragmenting liquidity. The financial services sector, while large, cannot generate the growth needed to offset the compounding losses in trade and manufacturing, and its own profitability is under constant competitive and regulatory assault. This fragile dominance is magnified by the second fatal flaw: the underinvestment trap. For decades, both public and private sectors in the UK have chronically underinvested in the foundational drivers of long-term economic prosperity: infrastructure and research and development, R&D. This is not a matter of temporary budget cuts. It is a sustained, systemic failure that has left the UK with an outdated, congested, and inefficient physical and intellectual infrastructure. Infrastructure paralysis is a profound drag on productivity. The UK's road networks, rail systems, and digital connectivity often lag behind those of its major European and North American rivals. Congested roads, unreliable public transport, and outdated utility networks impose huge, hidden costs on businesses through delays, breakdowns, and reduced supply chain efficiency. This paralysis reinforces the trade and logistics friction, ensuring that goods cannot move quickly or reliably within the country, further compounding the stagflationary environment. More critically, the lack of sustained R&D investment starves the UK of its future economic capacity. While the UK boasts world-class universities, the financial bridge between academic innovation and commercial scale-up is weak. Private sector investment in R&D often lags behind competitors, meaning that groundbreaking British inventions are frequently commercialized and scaled up in more capital-rich, subsidized environments, such as the US or China. This failure to translate innovation into mass-market industrial success limits the UK's ability to move up the value chain and generate the high productivity, high-wage jobs necessary to offset demographic and debt liabilities. The consequence of this underinvestment trap is that the UK lacks the fundamental capacity, both physical and intellectual, to grow its way out of its current debt and demographic crises. The only solution to high sovereign debt is a sustained period of high GDP growth, but the chronic underinvestment in the very tools infrastructure, R&D, that generate growth guarantees that such a scenario is politically and economically improbable. The convergence of these two flaws is terminal. The primary revenue generator, financial services, is shrinking and highly exposed to regulatory risk, while the core productive engine, manufacturing, technology, lacks the infrastructure and investment needed for a necessary rebound. The UK economy is thus trapped in a downward spiral. Low investment leads to low productivity, which necessitates higher taxation and borrowing to cover social costs, further deterring investment and cementing the structural decay. The model is broken beyond repair because the fundamental capacity to generate sufficient wealth has been compromised by a systemic failure to invest in the future. Conclusion and wealth strategy. The comprehensive analysis of the 5 fatal flaws: irreversible trade friction, logistics and labor paralysis, the demographic and debt time bomb, fragile financial dominance, and the underinvestment trap converges on a single, sobering conclusion. The economic crisis gripping the UK is not cyclical, but terminal and structural. The British economy is not merely facing a recession, it is undergoing a profound, self-inflicted decline that renders it structurally incapable of generating the sustained, high-level growth required to service its colossal debt, fund its social liabilities, and restore its competitive standing. The model is broken beyond repair, necessitating a radical shift in wealth preservation and investment strategy for anyone with exposure to the pound, sterling, and UK assets. The core of the UK's structural failure is the compounding effect of its vulnerabilities. Trade friction guarantees high costs and low efficiency, directly feeding the unique UK brand of stagflation, low growth, combined with persistent, domestically generated inflation fueled by labor scarcity. This economic attrition is occurring precisely at the moment the nation needs maximum output to confront its massive, non-negotiable liabilities. The exploding costs of state pensions and healthcare guaranteed by the demographic time bomb, the high national debt, coupled with the interest rate-sensitive housing market, creates a financial tripwire that paralyzes both fiscal and monetary policy. The UK is trapped in a policy paradox. Attempts to fix inflation, crash the economy, and attempts to stimulate growth worsen inflation and debt. For the international investor and the financially savvy individual, this structural diagnosis dictates a clear and urgent course of action. The pound sterling, GBP, must be viewed as a high-risk currency, exposed to both the persistent erosion of inflation and the volatility of political and regulatory flux. The focus must shift from seeking growth within the UK economy to implementing robust strategies for wealth preservation and geopolitical hedging. Wealth preservation strategy. Hedging against UK attrition. The strategy must be built around four core pillars designed to protect capital from the UK's compounding decline and to leverage the broader geopolitical trends currently draining capital from Europe. 1. Currency and geographic diversification. The USD anchor. The most immediate action is to reduce currency exposure to the pound sterling. The US dollar (USD) remains the structurally superior currency, benefiting from America's energy independence, massive domestic market, and aggressive state-backed industrial policy (IRA), CHIPS Act, which acts as a powerful magnet for global capital fleeing Europe. Actionable strategy. Increase allocation to USD-denominated assets. U.S. equities, particularly in subsidized high-tech sectors, and short-term U.S. Treasury instruments. For UK residents, this means consciously holding a substantial portion of liquid assets outside the GBP and outside the UK banking system's immediate jurisdiction. The goal is to escape the relentless, silent tax of UK domestic inflation and currency depreciation. 2. The gold standard hedge, escaping fiat failure. The UK's immense debt and demographic insolvency guarantee that fiscal pressure will be relentless, tempting future governments to allow inflation to run high as a means of silently devaluing the debt. Actionable strategy. Allocate a fixed percentage, typically $5, $dollar to $15, $dollar of total assets, to physical gold and high-quality gold mining stocks. Gold is the ultimate hedge against sovereign insolvency and fiat currency debasement. As the structural problems of the UK and EU make their currencies fundamentally weaker, gold provides a non-jurisdictional, trusted store of value that is immune to UK political risk or central bank mismanagement. 3. Sectoral avoidance and tactical shorting. The UK's structural flaws guarantee that certain sectors will face persistent headwinds and diminished profitability. Avoid companies highly reliant on domestic consumer spending, retail, hospitality, due to the crushing pressure of high inflation and mortgage costs on household budgets. Also avoid companies heavily exposed to the logistics and manufacturing sectors that are directly impacted by the trade friction and high domestic energy costs. Tactical shorting. Hedging. Consider tactical short positions or inverse ETFs against segments of the UK financial sector exposed to the housing market tripwire, such as highly leveraged property developers or non-diversified domestic banking stocks that would be crushed by mass mortgage distress induced by persistent high interest rates. 4. The global export pivot. In a low-growth, high-cost domestic environment, the only resilient UK companies are those that derive the majority of their revenue and profit from global exports, denominated in stronger currencies, USD, while maintaining efficient locally managed operational costs. Actionable strategy. Focus investment on UK-listed companies with genuine global reach and high-value intangible assets. For example, specialized software, defense technology, pharmaceuticals. These companies effectively use the UK as a base for R&D and talent, but generate their returns from outside the structurally challenged domestic economy, allowing them to repatriate foreign earnings that appreciate against the weakening pound. Final conclusion. The strategic imperative. The terminal nature of the UK's economic decay demands a strategic rather than a tactical response. The crisis is not transient, it is a permanent outcome of the compounding unfixable flaws detailed in this analysis. The UK lacks the structural capacity to grow its way out of the crisis, ensuring years of diminished returns, currency erosion, and political paralysis. For those dedicated to secret wealth tactics, this knowledge transforms a national economic tragedy into a clear, asymmetric investment opportunity. By aggressively hedging against the vulnerabilities of the pound and strategically positioning capital in regions that benefit from Europe's decline, you move from being a victim of structural decay to a beneficiary of global capital migration. The time for denial is over. The time for decisive financial action is now.